Chapter 2 of The Hidden Places. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Hidden Places by Bertrand W. Sinclair. Chapter 2. When Hollister was 18 years old, he had been briefly troubled by an affliction of his eyes, brought on from overstudy. His father, at the time, was interested in certain timber operations on the coast of British Columbia. In these rude camps, therefore, young Hollister spent a year. During that 12 months books were prohibited. He lived in the woods, restored the strength of his eyes amid that restful greenness, hardened a naturally vigorous body by healthy, outdoor labor with the logging crews. He returned home to go on with his university work in eastern Canada, with unforgettable impressions of the Pacific coast, a boyish longing to go back to that region where the mountains receded from the sea in wave after wave of enormous height, where the sea lapped with green lips at the foot of the ranges, and thrust winding arms back into the very heart of the land, and where the land itself, delta and slope and slide-engraved declivities, was clothed with great silent forests, upon which man, with his axes and saws, his machinery, his destructiveness in the name of industry, had as yet made little more impression than the nibbling of a single mouse on the rim of a large cheese. When he graduated, he did return on a 30 days' vacation, which the lure of the semi-wild country prolonged for 6 months, a whole summer in which he resisted the importunities of his father to take his part in the business upon which rested the family fortune. Hollister never forgot that summer. He was young. He had no cares. He was free. All life spread before him in a vast illusion of unquestionable joyousness. There was a rose-pink tinge over these months in which he fished salmon and trout, climbed the frowning escarpments of the Coast Range, gave himself up to the spell of a region which is still potent with the charm of the wilderness untamed. There had always lingered in his receptive mind a memory of profound beauty, a stark beauty of color and outline, an unhampered freedom, opportunity as vast as the mountains that looked from their cool heights down on the changeful sea and the hushed forests, brooding in the sun and rain. So he had come back again, after 7 years, scarcely knowing why he came, except that the coast beckoned with a remote gesture, and that he desired to get as far as possible from the charnel house of Europe, and that he shrank from presenting himself among the acquaintances of his boyhood and the few distant relatives left him upon the Atlantic seaboard. His father died shortly after Hollister married. He had left his son property aggregating several $1,000s and a complicated timber business disorganized by his sudden death. Hollister was young, sanguine, clever in the accepted sense of cleverness. He had married for love, urged thereto by a headlong, unquestioning, uncritical passion. But there were no obstacles. His passion was returned. There was nothing to make him ponder upon what a devastating, tyrannical force this emotion which he knew as love might become, this blind fever of the blood under cover of which nature works her ends, blandly indifferent to the consequences. Hollister was happy. He was ambitious. He threw himself with energy into a revival of his father's business when it came into his hands. His needs expanded with his matrimonial obligations. Considered casually, which was chiefly the manner of his consideration, his future was the future of a great many young men who begin life under reasonably auspicious circumstances. That is to say, he would be a success financially and socially, to as great an extent as he cared to aspire. He would acquire wealth and an expanding influence in his community. He would lead a tolerably pleasant domestic existence. He would be proud of his wife's beauty, her charm. He would derive a soothing contentment from her affection. He would take pleasure in friendships. In the end, of course, at some far-off, misty mile-post, he would begin to grow old. Then he would die in a dignified manner, full of years and honors, and his children would carry on after him. Hollister failed to reckon with the suavities of international diplomacy, with the forces of commercialism in relation to the markets of the world. The war burst upon and shattered the placidity of his existence very much as the bombs from the first Zeppelins shattered the peace and security of London and Paris. He reacted to the impetus of the German assault as young men of his class uniformly reacted. There was in Hollister's mind no doubt or equivocation about what he must do. But he did not embark upon this adventure joyously. He could not help weighing the chances. He understood that in this day and age he was a fortunate man. He had a great deal to lose. But he felt that he must go. He was not, however, filled with the witless idea that service with the expeditionary force was to be an adventure of some few months, a brief period involving some hardships and sharp fighting, but with an Allied army hammering at the gates of Berlin as a grand finale. The slaughter of the first encounters filled him with the conviction that he should put his house in order before he entered that bloody arena out of which he might not emerge. So that when he crossed the Channel the first time, he had disentangled himself from his business at a great loss, in order to have all his funds available for his wife in case of the ultimate disaster. Myra accompanied him to England, deferred their separation to the last hour. They could well afford that concession to their affection, they told each other. It was so hard to part. It scarcely seemed possible that 4 years had gone winging by since then, yet in certain moods it seemed to Hollister as if an eternity had passed. Things had been thus and so. They had become different by agonizing processes. He did not know where Myra was. He, himself, was here in Vancouver, alone, a stranger, a single speck of human wreckage cast on a far beach by the receding tides of war. He had no funds worth considering, but money was not as yet an item of consideration. He was not disabled. Physically he was more fit than he had ever been. The delicate mechanism of his brain was unimpaired. He had no bitterness, no illusions. His intellect was acute enough to suggest that in the complete shucking off of illusions lay his greatest peril. Life, as it faced him, the individual, appeared to be almost too grim a business to be endured without hopes and dreams. He had neither. He had nothing but moods. He walked slowly down Granville Street in the blackest mood which had yet come upon him. It differed from that strange feeling of terror which had taken him unaware the night before. He had fallen easy prey, then, to the black shadows of forlornness. He was still as acutely aware of the barrier which his disfigurement raised between him and other men. But with that morbid awareness there rose also now, for the first time, resentment against the smug folk who glanced at him and hurriedly averted their eyes. Slowly, by imperceptible degrees, as the tide rises on a sloping shore, his anger rose. The day was cold and sunny, a January morning with a touch of frost in the air. Men passed him, walking rapidly, clad in greatcoats. Women tripped by, wrapped in furs, eyes bright, cheeks glowing. And as they passed, singly, in chattering pairs, in smiling groups, Hollister observed them with a growing fury. They were so thoroughly insulated against everything disagreeable. All of them. A great war had just come to a dramatic close, a war in which staggering numbers of men had been sacrificed, body and soul, to enable these people to walk the streets in comfortable security. They seemed so completely unaware of the significance of his disfigured face. It was simply a disagreeable spectacle from which they turned with brief annoyance. Most of these men and women honored the flag. In a theater, at any public gathering, a display of the national colors caused the men to bare reverently their heads, the women to clap their hands with decorous enthusiasm. Without doubt, they were all agreed that it was a sacred duty to fight for one's country. How peculiar and illogical, then, he reflected, to be horrified at the visible results of fighting for one's country, of saving the world for democracy. The thing had had to be done. A great many men had been killed. A great number had lost their legs, their arms, their sight. They had suffered indescribable mutilations and disabilities in the national defense. These people were the nation. Those who passed him with a shocked glance at his face must be aware that fighting involves suffering and scars. It appeared as if they wished to ignore that. The inevitable consequences of war annoyed them, disturbed them, when they came face to face with those consequences. Hollister imagined them privately thinking he should wear a mask. After all, he was a stranger to these folk, although he was their countryman and a person of consequence, until the war and Myra and circumstances conspired against him. He stifled the resentment which arose from a realization that he must expect nothing else, that it was not injustice so much as stupidity. He reflected that this was natural. A cynical conclusion arose in his mind. There was no substance, after all, in this loose talk about sympathy and gratitude and the obligation of a proud country to those who had served overseas. Why should there be? He was an individual among other individuals who were unconsciously actuated by rampant individualism except in moments of peril, when stark necessity compelled them to social action. Otherwise, it was every man for himself. Yes, it was natural enough. He was a stranger to these people. Except for the color of his skin, he was no more to them than a Hindu or a Japanese. And doubtless the grotesque disarrangement of his features appalled them. How could they discern behind that caricature of a face the human desire for friendliness, the ache of a bruised spirit? He deliberately clamped down the lid upon such reflections, and bethought himself of the business which brought him along the street. Turning off the main thoroughfare, he passed half a block along a cross street and entered an office building. Ascending to the 4th floor, he entered an elaborate suite of offices which bore upon the ground glass of the entrance door this legend: Lewis and Company, Specialists in B.C. Timber Investments. He inquired for Mr. Lewis, gave his card to a young woman who glanced at him once, and thereafter looked anywhere but at him while he spoke. After a minute of waiting, he was ushered into a private office. As he neared this door, Hollister happened to catch a panoramic glimpse in a wall mirror. The eyes of half a dozen clerks and other persons in that room, both male and female, were fixed on him with the shocked and eager curiosity he had once observed upon the faces of a crowd gathered about the mangled victim of a street accident. Mr. Lewis was a robust man, a few years older than Hollister. The cares of a rapidly developing business and certain domestic ties had prevented Mr. Lewis from offering himself upon the altar of his country. The responsibility of 8% investments entrusted to his care was not easily shaken off. Business, of course, was a national necessity. However, since the armistice, Mr. Lewis had ceased to be either explanatory or inferentially apologetic, even in his own thought, for his inability to free himself from the demands of commerce during a critical period. In any case, he was there, sound in wind and limb, a tall, square-shouldered, ruddy man of 35, seated behind an oak desk, turning Hollister's card over in his fingers with an anticipatory smile. Blankness replaced the smile. A sort of horrified wonder gleamed in his eyes. Hollister perceived that his face shocked the specialist in B.C. timber, filled Mr. Lewis with very mixed sensations indeed. "You have my card. It is several years since we met. I dare say you find me unrecognizable," Hollister said bluntly. "Nevertheless, I can identify myself to your satisfaction." A peculiarity of Hollister's disfigurement was the immobility of his face. The shell which had mutilated him, the scalpels of the German field surgeons who had perfunctorily repaired the lacerations, had left the reddened, scar-distorted flesh in a rigid mold. He could neither recognizably smile nor frown. His face, such as it was set in unchangeable lines. Out of this rigid, expressionless mask his eyes glowed, blue and bright, having escaped injury. They were the only key to the mutations of his mind. If Hollister's eyes were the windows of his soul, he did not keep the blinds drawn, knowing that few had the hardihood to peer into those windows now. Mr. Lewis looked at him, looked away, and then his gaze came slowly back, as if drawn by some fascination against which he struggled in vain. He did not wish to look at Hollister, yet he was compelled to look. He seemed to find difficulty in speech, this suave man of affairs. "I am afraid I shouldn't have recognized you, as you say," he uttered at last. "Have you "I've been overseas," Hollister answered the unspoken question. That strange curiosity, tinctured with repulsion. "The result is obvious." "Most unfortunate," Mr. Lewis murmured. "But your scars are honorable. A brother of mine lost an arm at Loos." "The brothers of a good many people lost more than their arms at Loos," Hollister returned dryly. "But that is not why I called. You recollect, I suppose, that when I was out here last I bought a timber limit in the Toba from your firm. When I went overseas I instructed you to sell. What was done in that matter?" Mr. Lewis's countenance cleared at once. He was on his own ground again, dealing with matters in which he was competent, in consultation with a client whom he recalled as a person of consequence, the son of a man who had likewise been of considerable consequence. Personal undesirability was always discounted in the investment field, the region of per centum returns. Money talked, in arrogant tones that commanded respect. He pressed a button. "Bring me," he ordered the clerk who appeared, "all correspondence relating to this matter," and he penciled a few sentences on a slip of paper. He delved into the papers that were presently set before him. "Ah, yes," he said. "Lot 2027, situated on the south slope of the Toba Valley. Purchased for your account, July 1912. Sale ordered October 1914. We had some correspondence about that early in 1915, while you were in London. Do you recall it, Mr. Hollister?" "Yes. You wrote that the timber market was dead, that any sale possible must be at a considerable sacrifice. Afterward, when I got to the front, I had no time to think about things like that. But I remember writing you to sell, even at a sacrifice." Yes, quite so," Mr. Lewis agreed. "I recall the whole matter very clearly. Conditions at that time were very bad, you know. It was impossible to find a purchaser on short notice. Early in 1917 there was a chance to sell, at a considerably reduced figure. But I couldn't get in touch with you. You didn't answer our cable. I couldn't take the responsibility of a sacrifice sale." Hollister nodded. In 1917 he was a nameless convalescent in a German hospital. Officially, he was dead. Months before that, such things as distant property rights had ceased to be of any moment. He had forgotten this holding of timber in British Columbia. He was too full of bitter personal misery to trouble about money. "Failing to reach you, we waited until we should hear from you, or from your estate." Mr. Lewis cleared his throat, as if it embarrassed him to mention that contingency. "In war, there was that possibility, you understand. We did not feel justified. So much time had elapsed. There was risk to us in acting without verifying our instructions." "So this property is still to be marketed. The carrying charges, as I remember, were small. I presume you carried them?" "Oh, assuredly," Mr. Lewis asserted. "We protected your interests to the very best of our ability." "Well, find me a buyer for that limit as soon as you can," Hollister said abruptly. "I want to turn it into cash." "We shall set about this at once," Mr. Lewis said. "It may take a little time. Conditions, as a result of the armistice, are again somewhat unsettled in the logging industry. Airplane spruce production is dead as a salt mackerel, and fir and cedar slumped with it. However, we shall do our best. Have you a price in mind, Mr. Hollister, for a quick sale?" "I paid $10,000 for it. On the strength of your advice as a specialist in timber investments," he added with a touch of malice. He had taken a dislike to Mr. Lewis. He had not been so critical of either men or motives in the old days. He had remembered Lewis as a good sort. Now he disliked the man, distrusted him. He was too smooth, too sleek. "I'll discount that 20% for a cash sale." Mr. Lewis made a memorandum. "Very good," said he, raising his head with an inquiring air, as if to say, "If that is all—" "If you will kindly identify me at a bank," Hollister rose from his chair, "I shall cease to trouble you. I have a draft on the Bank of B.N.A. I do not know anyone in Vancouver." "No trouble, I assure you," Lewis hastened to assent, but his tone lacked heartiness, sincerity. It was only a little distance to the bank, but Lewis insisted on making the journey in a motor car which stood at the curb. It was plain to Hollister that Mr. Lewis disliked the necessity of appearing in public with him, that he took this means of avoiding the crowded sidewalks, of meeting people. He introduced Hollister, excused himself on the plea of business pressure, and left Hollister standing before the teller's wicket. This was not a new attitude to Hollister. People did that, as if he were a plague. There came into his mind, as he stood counting the sheaf of notes slide through a grill by a teller who looked at him once and thereafter kept his eyes averted, a paraphrase of a hoary quotation: "I am a monster of such frightful mien, as to be hated needs but to be seen." The rest of it, Hollister thought grimly, could never apply to him. He put the money in his pocket and walked out on the street. It was a busy corner on a humming thoroughfare. Electric cars rumbled and creaked one behind another on the double tracks. Waves of vehicular traffic rolled by the curb. A current of humanity flowed past him on the sidewalk. Standing there for a minute, Hollister felt again the slow rising of his resentment against these careless, fortunate ones. He could not say what caused that feeling. A look, a glance, the inevitable shrinking. He was morbidly sensitive. He knew that, knew it was a state of mind that was growing upon him. But from whatever cause, that feeling of intolerable isolation gave way to an inner fury. As he stood there, he felt a wild desire to shout at these people, to curse them, to seize one of these dainty women by the arms, thrust his disfigured face close to hers, and cry, "Look at me as if I were a man, not a monstrosity. I'm what I am so that you could be what you are. Look at me, damn you!" He pulled himself together and walked on. Certainly he would soon run amuck if he did not get over feeling like that, if he did not master these impulses which bordered on insanity. He wondered if that inner ferment would drive him insane. He went back to the second-rate hotel where he had taken refuge, depressed beyond words, afraid of himself, afraid of the life which lay in fragments behind him and spread away before him in terrifying drabness. Yet he must go on living. To live was the dominant instinct. A man did not put on or off the desire to live as he put on or off his coat. But life promised nothing. It was going to be a sorry affair. It struck Hollister with disheartening force that an individual is nothing, absolutely nothing, apart from some form of social grouping. And society, which had exacted so much from him, seemed peculiarly indifferent to the consequences of those imperative exactions, seemed wholly indifferent to his vital need. And it was not reward or recognition of service performed that Hollister craved. He did not want to be pensioned or subsidized to have medals pinned on him. What he wanted was chiefly to forget the war and what the war had visited upon him and others like him. Hollister suffered solely from that sense of being held outside the warm circle of human activities, fellowships, friendliness. If he could not overcome that barrier which people threw up around themselves at contact with him, if he could not occasionally know the sound of a friendly voice, he felt that he would very soon go mad. A man cannot go on forever enduring the pressure of the intolerable. Hollister felt that he must soon arrive at a crisis. What form it would take, he did not know, and in certain moods he did not care. On the landing at the end of the narrow corridor off which his room opened, he met a man in uniform whom he recognized, a young man who had served under him in the 44th, who had won a commission on the field. He wore a captain's insignia now. Hollister greeted him by name. "Hello, Tommy." The captain looked at him. His face expressed nothing whatever. Hollister waited for that familiar shadow of distaste to appear. Then he remembered that, like himself, Rutherford must have seen thousands upon thousands of horribly mutilated men. "Your voice," Rutherford remarked at length, "has a certain familiar sound. Still, I can't say I know you. What's the name?" "Bob Hollister. Do you remember the bottle of Scotch we pinched from the Black Major behind the brick wall on the Albert Road? Naturally, you wouldn't know me, with this face." "Well," Rutherford said, as he held out his hand, "a fellow shouldn't be surprised at anything any more. I understood you'd gone west. Your face is mussed up a bit. Rotten luck, huh?" Hollister felt a lump in his throat. It was the first time for months that any human being had met him on common ground. He experienced a warm feeling for Rutherford. And the curious thing about that was that out of the realm of the subconscious rose instantly the remembrance that he had never particularly liked Tommy Rutherford. He was one of the wild men of the battalion. When they went up the line, Rutherford was damnably cool and efficient, a fatalist who went about his grim business unmoved. Back in rest billets he was always pursuing some woman, unearthing surplus stores of whiskey or wine, intent upon dubious pleasures. A handsome, self-centered, debonair animal. "My room's down here," Hollister said. "Come in and gas a bit, if you aren't bound somewhere." "Oh, all right. I came up here to see a chap, but he's out. I have half an hour or so to spare." Rutherford stretched himself on Hollister's bed. They lit cigarettes and talked. And as they talked, Rutherford kept looking at Hollister's face, until Hollister at last said to him, "Doesn't it give you the willies to look at me?" Rutherford shook his head. "Oh, no. I've got used to seeing fellows all twisted out of shape. You seem to be fit enough otherwise." "I am," Hollister said moodily. "But it's a devil of a handicap to have a mug like this." "Makes people shy off, huh? Women particularly. I can imagine," Rutherford drawled. "Tough luck, all right. People don't take very much stock in fellows that got smashed. Not much of a premium on disfigured heroes these days." Hollister laughed harshly. "No, we're at a discount. We're duds." For half an hour they chatted more or less one-sidedly. Rutherford had a grievance which he took pains to air. He was on duty at Hastings Park, having been sent there a year earlier to instruct recruits, after recovering from a wound. He was the military man, par excellence. War was his game. He had been anxious to go to Siberia with the Canadian contingent which had just departed. And the High Command had retained him here to assist in the inglorious routine of demobilization. Rutherford was disgruntled. Siberia had promised new adventure, change, excitement. The man, Hollister soon perceived, was actually sorry the war was over. Sorry that his occupation was gone. He talked of resigning and going to Mexico, to offer his sword to whichever proved the stronger faction. It would be a picnic after the Western Front. A man could whip a brigade of those greasers into shape and become a power. There ought to be good chances for loot. Yet Hollister enjoyed his company. Rutherford was genial. he was the first man for long to accept Hollister as a human being. He promised to look Hollister up again before he went away. The world actually seemed cheerful to Hollister after Rutherford had gone, until, in moving about the room, he caught sight of his face in the mirror. End of chapter 2. Recording by Roger Moline.